All right. So the biggest issue is that we're all stuck in systems that are based on a scarcity economy when there's actually more than enough for everybody. So, we as artists have to fight for arbitrary access to resources. It's because we've been permanently put into a marginalized position where the actual essential dynamic between us and other people is not validated. And that inequitable structure is sustained by a series of false narratives. Um, so I was inspired by the quote from the science fiction writer Henry Gibson, who invented the term cyberspace and was an advanced thinker way back when he first started writing. He said, eventually education is going to all have to be online. And it's so strange to hear that prediction, during this time when, we're online right now. So I want to sort of, before I'm going to walk through, some of the false narratives that allow to sustain these unsustainable structures. But then I'm going to talk about examples where that segregation of function gets broken down so that when there is a better flow between what artists have to give and receive from other parts of the culture, that tends to attract resources. So part of the reason that we don't get the money that we need or the respect that we need or the power that we need to sustain ourselves in a healthy fashion is because we're not in a functional relationship to other parts of the culture. So I'll talk more about that in just a bit. Well, I'll start with an example of the Chicago Arts Partnerships in Education, which ended up with me getting to know Simon and, helping develop programs in England and Australia. I was just, a visiting teaching artist who used to get occasional gigs. And I was the artistic director of a small theater company that struggled for dollars. And then there was this idea in Chicago that there might need to be an organization that created long-term partnerships between artists and schools. And the arts in education in the US had been struggling ever since Dewey and the progressive education era, from in the 30s. It's like over 100, it's almost 100 years since arts was recognized as a core part of instruction. So arts teachers and visiting artists were always fighting for a slice of the curriculum pie. So there wasn't enough time or money for all the different people that young people need to have a learning relationship with. So arts education advocates all were in the position of trying to fight over limited dollars and limited time. So the idea was that it was a one-directional, there was only so much time, only so much money, and the artist didn't count. So we were fighting for, yes, we do, and you got to cut back on some of the math so we have room. So the segregation of function set up a competitive relationship between our access to resources and all other educational people. And it was a losing battle. So what was interesting about CAPE, the Chicago Arts Partnerships in Education, was the thesis was not who gets a slice of the curriculum pie, who gets some time and some money, but the real problem was what do kids need and what kind of people do kids need access to in order to be successful learners? And when the problem and function was posed differently, the schools started to see the artist as contributing to the shared problem, if solving the shared problem. So we started to have, we had dynamic relationships with teachers and with other artists and across disciplines. And it became part of the fabric of the schools we were involved in. And so it wasn't like the artists were fighting for their piece of the curriculum pie, is that the problem was not who gets some of the curriculum monies in time. The problem was what needs to happen in schools so that the kids succeed. And when the problem was framed that way, we actually became valuable. It also meant that we couldn't be proud elites. You know, we're more creative and smarter and more wonderful and love the kids better than you, so you got to move over. We actually had a shared um, problem and opportunity with the other teachers and with the parents and with the communities. So it completely reframed the flow of resources and the value and purpose of our presence. So some of the schools that started working with us now 30 years ago, um, some of those artists have become part of the faculty of some of those Chicago public schools. And there's a whole organization that exists to raise money for Chicago public schools to bring more arts into the curriculum, and the district started to develop new art standards. And when CAPE started out, the idea of what artists were was limited to, some not very contemporary ideas about visual art and some very limited ideas about music. So there was a terrible contract that there was a half a music or art teacher for every 750 kids. And that art or music teacher didn't have to teach art or music, could be used as a reading teacher or cover as a substitute. So by changing the structural dynamic, we were able to make a sustainable system. Am I making any sense here? Is this, you know, we got to think about what are the roles and relationships that are the assumptions about what we're doing in any places where we work. Because the assumptions, and I'll start going through those, that are set up and that are virally spread through the education systems guarantee that our presence will never be sustainable because we're seen as an additional ornament. We're not see our presence isn't seen as something that's actually a function of the schools. So I'll sort of run through quickly some of those hierarchical narratives. Um, and then I'll talk about things that have happened that have changed that narrative so that the presence and value of the artist gets more sustainable. So one big one is that the winner takes all, that the purpose of being an artist is to be famous, or to be rich. And folks heard about this economist, Richard Florida. He's looked at economies of cities. And one of the things he found out was that cities that were comfortable with diversity, like creative types and analytical types and different cultural mixes and different gender identities, that those cities did better economically. And the cities who tried to categorize people into separate blocks did not do well. Of course, the right wing hated him because, he was an advocate for trans people and gay people and artists and people of color. But it was an understanding that the health of the culture depended on a diverse set of contributions from a bunch of different, very different people. And when we get into the position of saying, you've left us out because we're different, and you got to let us in and we need to get ours, we mostly get pushback. Oh, you can have a few grants or a few contracts, and if you're famous and you're rich, then you count. But if you're making art because your art demands of you that you have to make it, you don't count. And what he posited was that is actually economically inaccurate in terms of city health, but it is how most cities are run. Am I being clear about this? Is the point I'm making being transparent, that our social functions have been defined in ways that they're not really addressing what we have to give in collaboration with other people. So that's one. The other is that, the romantic notion that the artist has to be a sufferer, and that, that this is a solo activity and it's not part of a social dynamic. It's not collaborative, and it's not done by women, and it's not done by young people, and it's not done by people of color. So there's the idea that you have to be super talented, super rich, super famous, and a white guy, and older, and and you got to suffer, but then people will think you're great. Then, of course, there's the idea that, and the problem is that most people have not been acknowledged for their own artistic practice, that as we become an increasingly commodity culture, there's less participation in the arts by the general population. So we're increasingly seen as outsiders. Um, and this has shown up in education. When I was a child in the 50s, all my teachers had had extensive training in the arts in teachers' college. There was a piano in every classroom, and all my teachers could play piano. And now, I've worked with a lot of colleges of education, and just experiencing of art making has been removed from teachers' training. So that in education, teachers don't understand that they already have a relationship with artists and the arts. So there's been this really industrial economics model of an assembly line of roles, relationships, and functions. So that's what we need to deconstruct, because if we don't, then we'll always be in the position of begging for money and feeling like we're excluded, but special and excluded, and we're not really going to get it, and we have to fight for each other for the crumbs. The other problem in terms of the arts is that there's been a segregation set up between contemporary art practice, which tends to be largely conceptual and process-based and uses lots of different media, and what the general population conceives of as the arts, which is classical forms that they don't really like, but they think they're supposed to admire. You're supposed to admire Shakespeare, but you're really supposed to be bored by it. Art is classical European pieces, or traditional folkloric art forms. And there's no understanding that art and culture are always dynamic and changing. And it's actually a dialogue between different art forms, different traditions. In Chicago, where a lot of private collectors collected impressionists who were considered just cockamamie weirdos at the time, but some rich people wanted to collect it, and they created the Art Institute, the famous Art Institute of Chicago, in order to get a tax discount on their private collections. And so even though the Impressionists were kind of, crazy madmen when they were painting, that became the tradition. And, anything that wasn't, Impressionism was considered horrible and irrelevant. Same thing happened with jazz, same thing happened with blues, Any new media that came forward was considered not really art until it was old and some rich people owned it. And then any contemporary practice was considered just too crazy and stupid for anyone to bother with. And so there's been a false dichotomy set between traditional art forms and art making and contemporary practices. I've been doing a lot of work with innovative, progressive preschool educators. And one of the things we discovered is that there's a lot more congruence between the art making practices of preschoolers and contemporary artists. because they're interested in process, they're interested in the ideas, they're interested in the encounters with materials, and they're interested in the social life of whatever art they produce. And so we have a population that's been educated against seeing any alignment with what we do and produce. And we've also been trained to feel superior to non-creative types and to feel wounded by our exclusion. Um, so we it's useful for us to start thinking about new formulations where what we have to give and receive is in confluence with other people who are trying to solve similar problems. Um, and I go into more detail about all of these in the document, but basically, um, there's a problem of um, it's really an industrial economy model, assembly line model of the fragmentation of social functions, and then the categorization of different people having no relationships with each other. So that, white collar workers have no real relationship with blue collar workers, and white people have no relationships with black people, and artists have no relationships to non-artists. And to start thinking about what are some of our joint problems and opportunities to work together, um, uh, I think becomes the solution for the marginalization, essentially defunding and competitive framework placed on artists. So I start to look around for examples where these sort of new dynamics were starting to appear. And um, I don't have a really good solution about how we leverage this up, because lots of well-intentioned funding initiatives, including the ones that Simon works on, are, and the discussion that we just had before the group started. It's some artists who are socially engaged and some funders who want to sort of plug the holes in systems. Um, uh, that's kind of a steam valve for dysfunctional systems. So we got to think about how the relationships that we want to have um, become more robust and sustainable, so that schools who normally would keep, hiring an art teacher in Chicago for a while, and then, when the funding got tight, getting rid of that, those schools have held on to working with the Cape artists. Some of them have been working together for 30 years. Um, so it has to do with a new, more dynamic, sustainable, substantive relationship between what an artist contributes to an initiative, an organization, or a social group's problem solving, um, and um, the access to resources. Um, when Cape first started, a lot of the schools really didn't like having artists coming into the schools. But it was when new technology was first starting to come into public schools. And so we started training, and Simon taught, Simon showed me the first digital video camera I ever saw, which is now like second nature. But at the time, no one had the idea that any tools for new technology would be interesting to artists or to teachers or to parents or to kids or to community members. So what we did was we started offering little workshops on how to create websites and use new video cameras. And the teachers and the artists were trained together, and they were both encountering new mechanisms for teaching and learning and creating together, and that changed the dynamic. We stopped being called the art Nazis, and kind of the artists and the teachers kind of fell in love with each other. But we had created a context in which we were both exploring and problem solving and doing well for kids. And that's what changed the dynamic, and that's what changed the funding. So I'll go through some other examples. Um, And these are in the document. So there's a collective of Black artists in Chicago called the Let Us Breathe Collective. Um, and they started out, there was a police building where there were a lot of people being detained under false pretenses and being literally tortured. So they set up, there was a vacant lot across the street, and these artists started to setting up free food booths and free clothing booths and free art classes. And they, for like a year, camped out outside this torture site of the police department. And, um, and that grew a whole dynamic of the community starting to have a relationship with these artists. And all these years later, that collective is still going. And some people found a beautiful property that they rent now for $1 a year, and they do community workshops, and there's a community recording center. They now are giving micro grants to artists to develop work to address the pandemic. Um, so it's not perfect. They're underfunded, but the fact that they found a new dynamic, a sustainable new dynamic between the needs of the community and the needs of the artist attracted resources. It's not magic, but it's a model of how we need to reconceive the problem. Hyde Park Arts Center developed a process for the separation between veteran artists and young emerging artists. And they set up a mentoring system where, veteran artists are paid to be available to young emerging artists who are taking on their first ambitious large scale project. And so we didn't wait, it became part of their normal functioning of the organization, that there was the dynamic of cross-generational dialogue. It wasn't a special grant for a limited period. It became business as usual, that there was a mechanism for the ongoing mentoring that needs to happen for artist practice to disseminate across generations. Um, at the GOMA, the wonderful modern art museum in Brisbane. Um, I visited there, and they set up all these really sophisticated computer systems where all of these emerging design artists come in, and they're able to get free access to the most fully professional design technology that they want. So this museum is something that I call InReach. You weren't just there to gawk at the famous contemporary artists. The function of the museum was also to give access to the tools of emerging new artists. And that was part of the life of the museum. So it wasn't a one-directional we worship at the Temple of the Arts. It was a village green for the production and the access to tools for the whole community. It's a very different model. I work a lot with Free Write Arts and Literacy, which brings contemporary artists of color into the youth jails, the youth detention center. I've been working with them for 15 years now. And it's pretty incredible, because these kids who've had really, terrible lives, they've been thrown in jail for selling a single joint, by cops who are stealing their stash and selling it themselves. And they've had hard lives. They come from really violent neighborhoods. A lot of times while they're in jail, they find out that their best friend has been killed. They're rough, but they're really sweet guys and gals. And when they come out, you know, through their experience of being acknowledged as valuable people with leadership skills, they have organized their own performance venues. So it's a traveling monthly show where there's a professional level master class one month it was about, clothing design, and other months it's about making videos, and, it's often about writing. And it's an open stage. Um, and so the young people realized through the arts that they could become healers and leaders in their own community. And um, they also were no longer, the arts allowed them to not be isolated in space, so that kids who are in lockdown in prison are recording their spoken word poetry, and they're competing in Louder Than a Bomb, which is the world's largest poetry slam. And in the document I sent you, there's a video of Nakia, who's now become one of these youth leaders, um, performing through a recording while she's in jail to a crowd of 2,000 other kids. So they found a way around the artists not having access to venues for their art by just creating their own venues. Um, Another really important model is the Reggio Emilia approach, where after World War II, when most of the men who had been killed by Mussolini's regime, the women decided that they would form a form of education that would help make young children become immune to fascist thought. And the solution they had was for professional artists to become part of the faculty of all the preschools in the town. And that teaching artist is called an ArTELIERista. And it's just into the DNA of that entire school system in that school. And it's incredible work. And one of their ideas is that called the city in waiting, that children are not future citizens, that they're full citizens from the time they're born, and that the city needs their artwork in order to be a city. So that the city opera house's fire curtain was painted by preschoolers. And there's exhibitions and process documentation of kids thinking installed all over the whole city. And that methodology of making the artist a standard part of solving the problem of how do you educate preschoolers in order to feel their own power and capacity um, has spread all over the world. So that my methodologies that Victoria and Simon helped me develop rose largely out of um, out of Reggio methodology. And it has to do with documentation, and it has to do with having people pursuing their own curiosity. So there are some structures that are actually recognizing the funded, sustained, crucial role for the artists. Um, Another example is the ARC that Simon was consultant to in Dublin, and also became the model for his work in Melbourne, where there was a permanent structure that recognized the role that artists had in the life of children and contributed to the children making a substantive, visible contribution to the culture of the city. I just earlier was on a planning meeting with ABLA, the Center for Language and Culture, in Merida, Mexico. And that is a center where, where teachers from all over the Americas come each summer to learn about how to become better teachers by replanning their methodology with artists. And we go digital in a couple weeks. It's 250 American dollars for any of you who want to sign up for that week. I can send you information. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to zip through the last couple so we have some discussion time. I was the curriculum consultant for an initiative called Envisioning Justice, in which we worked with 7 communities in Chicago that are subject to very high levels of mass incarceration, where like a lot of the men are in jail. for all kinds of specious charges. Um, and there's a website called Million Dollar Blocks. Um, there's like in the black and brown neighborhoods in Chicago, the city spends over $1 million on individual blocks in incarcerating people in that block. So it's astonishing the amount of money that is invested, not in making sure that there's grocery stores or hospitals in those neighborhoods, but on putting people in jail. So we worked with money from the Illinois Humanities Council. We brought a bunch of artists from those different neighborhoods into community centers, and people from the neighborhoods made artwork about the issues of mass incarceration. And then it was exhibited at this very prestigious gallery, the Sullivan Gallery of the School of the Art Institute. It was up for 3 months, and all kinds of people came through, and it really advanced the social discourse about issues of racism, white supremacy, and mass incarceration in Chicago. And it contributed enormously to the Black Lives Matter movement in Chicago. And then last off, I really encourage you to read this article about, completely rethinking the restaurant industry. This is a social activist who's an artist and does all sorts of whacked installations about rethinking people's access to food. But what I found most interesting was after we recover, hopefully, like a phoenix from the ashes of the pandemic, we have to think about completely differently about how we get food, who profits, who doesn't, who has oppressive jobs, who has unsustainable jobs. All the waiters in this whole country are starving now because they're all out of work and they have no unemployment. So we're almost out of time. I encourage you to read through the 10 policy proposals, because these are some things that, if they were structurally made permanent, would help solve all these problems. And these were, I wrote these up 15 years ago when I was the only person from the Western Hemisphere at a UNESCO conference in Seoul, Korea, talking about the significance of reclaiming the arts in effective school reform. And there was a lot of really interesting thinking at that conference. But I wrote up, my talk was, what do we do about marginalization? And I wrote up these 10 policy proposals 15 years ago, but they're really more relevant now. All right, so we really are almost out of time. I wanted to have 15 minutes for us.